Hi there, Social 30-1 here. Source number three of the week. We're looking at citizenship in action. Uh, Last source you'll ever do in social studies 30-1 or high school for that matter. Last source we'll ever do together. I hope you like the sources. I hope you got something out of them. To me, it's the single most important thing we did in social studies for all 3 years of high school. You're applying knowledge, you're interpreting, you're practicing literacy, you're applying skills and things that you know to a source, an image, and that's going to be your whole life if you want to keep up on current events. So I hope you kept doing the sources. I hope you learned from them. And I hope you'll spend the rest of your life critiquing things that you see going on in the world, newspaper headlines, tweets, cartoons, photographs, news clips, whatever it might be. I hope you spend the rest of your life critically analyzing information, global events. Um, I think that you will. I think you're a better person being able to do that. Anyway, on to today's source. If you have seen the Tankman clip, that will help. The Tankman clip is part of today's lesson. You've probably heard of Tank Man. You probably have even seen this photo at some point. So if you want, you could look at the Tank Man clip first and then apply it to the photograph that you're looking at. But you don't have to have seen Tank Man to figure out what's going on here. In fact, that might be a good test for you, is without having the circumstances, the specific events of Tank Man, see if you can figure out what's going on in the photograph. Probably, well, I think undoubtedly the most iconic photograph in all of the 20th century. I mean, if there's one photograph that captured a moment in time, if there's one photograph that most people have seen, it would be this image of Tank Man. So I'll give you a few seconds to soak in the photograph and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so the first thing that strikes me when I look at the photograph is the man. No one knows who he is. He's a mystery. His nickname is Tank Man. But what always struck me was his stature when compared to the tanks. I mean, these are Russian-made Chinese T-72 tanks. They would be as high as the classroom ceiling. They would be higher than your living room ceiling if you've got a standard 8 or 9 foot ceiling. Huge, gigantic pieces of machinery that are very deadly. I mean, they're built to kill. They rumble, they're loud, they're massive. And watch the video later on in class, but what he basically does is these tanks, and you see the first four, what you don't see are the other 12 behind these four. And this is in the morning after the Beijing massacre in June of 1989. And what you see is him standing in front of the first four, but not the remaining tanks behind. And these tanks were parading down this street in Beijing, China. They were on parade. They were swiveling their turrets. They were. It's called tank dancing. Anyway, this citizen just walked in front of the tanks and stopped them. He stopped them dead in their tracks. And I remember watching it. I was in university in June of 1989. And look at the date. They celebrated the anniversary just last week. But I remember watching on TV and I'm thinking, well, they're just going to run this guy over. I mean, the night before in Beijing, China, they massacred thousands of Beijing citizens. They killed people for doing way less than what he did on TV. I mean, don't forget this was captured on video, and all kinds of photographers captured this image too. So they killed people for doing way less than what this guy did. And I remember thinking as I watched this, they're just going to kill this guy. But they didn't, at least not right away. And so you'll see all that when you watch the video later on. But what you get is a citizen standing up to the tanks. And what you have to think now is that, it's a Chinese tank convoy. Who sent the tanks? Well, the Chinese government. So the tanks are representative of the Chinese government, which of course is non-democratic and quite repressive in a lot of ways, especially in the 1980s. And so given what I know about China, it's a dictatorship. It would have been the government that sent these tanks in. He's obviously standing up to the Chinese government. He's standing up to authoritarianism. He's standing up to a dictatorship. What would he want? Well, he probably wants liberal reform. He probably wants things like free speech. He wants freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of thought. He wants democracy. He wants liberal reforms. So you can piece all that together without knowing the specific events behind Tiananmen, without knowing what happened before this photograph, without knowing what happened after the photograph. You could figure out what this guy's standing up to and what he would want. If it didn't say Chinese tank convoy, you'd be struggling. You'd be wondering, well, where would this be? This could be Hungary, this could be Czechoslovakia, God knows where it could be. But we know it's China. And we know that China is a dictatorship. And we know that he's standing up to the Chinese tanks that symbolize the Chinese government. We know that he wants democratic reform. Given that he is just a common man, theories are he was just a guy coming home from work. The theory is he was a guy who had just worked the night shift, was on his way home from work, and confronted the tank convoy. So, in a sense, he's the common man. He represents the common man. He's an unknown citizen. He is an unknown figure that stood up to the Chinese government. And that might make it even more of a compelling photograph that he's a nobody virtually. If he was someone famous, well, that would mean something. But the fact that he's a nobody to me gives the photograph more meaning. That could have been any citizen in China. He stood for any citizen in China at that time, and maybe even today. So that's probably as far as you can take your interpretation. You know that today China is still a dictatorship, still an authoritarian regime. And so, one thing you could add is that, this citizens' protest, in at least in the immediate future, was unsuccessful. China didn't get its democracy. He didn't get what he wanted when he stood in front of the tanks. But maybe all he really wanted was to bring attention to the cause. Maybe he just wanted to bring attention to the protest. And certainly in the years following this photograph, Tank Man becomes the symbol for freedom on the planet. Tank Man becomes the symbol for the 1989 revolutions in Eastern Europe, in which countries like Eastern Germany and Czechoslovakia and Hungary all got rid of their communist dictatorships and brought in democracy. When they marched in protest in the fall of '89 in the name of democracy in Eastern Europe, they were inspired by Tankman. They basically said, if that kid can do what he did in front of the tanks, um, we can do what we're doing in Czechoslovakia. We can stand up to the government in East Germany and Poland and so on. And that virtually ended communism. Well, it did end communism in Eastern Germany. So maybe Tank Man was successful after all, in that even though they didn't get democracy in China, they did get democracy in all of Eastern Europe, and it was the end of the Berlin Wall and the entire Iron Curtain. So you could certainly talk about that. Finally, last time we'll ever do this too, in terms of our links, well, usually when people protest, they're protesting a government that has put itself above the rule of law. And that's certainly what Tank Man's doing. He's advocating for greater individual rights and freedoms, for sure. He's sick of his government acting in its own self-interest and not allowing him the chance to pursue his own self-interest. So you can certainly link it to links from the course that way. We also see a guy who's advocating for liberalism. This is what he wants. He wants what we've got. He wants the right to say what he wants to say. He wants the right to hold his government accountable. He wants the right to associate with whomever he wants. He wants liberalism. He wants what we probably take for granted every single day. I can't think of anything else you might want to point out on the source. You really need to watch the video. It's not long. It's about 20 minutes. It's one of the most compelling videos you'll ever see in your life. And then finally, for the last time, let's do our relationships. So again, step one, when we figure out relationships, we need to pick a theme or a concept and link all sources to that theme or concept. So there was source one, a quote, a finding on civil resistance. Talked about the importance of civil resistance being non-violent, and that non-violent acts of civil resistance um, got what they wanted more often than the violent ones. So the violent revolution fails in the long term, whereas the non-violent campaign has lasting power. It has staying power. Source two, just from yesterday, the Black Lives Matter protest. And then finally, the one we just did today, Tank Man. So take a few seconds and see if you can figure out a theme that might connect all sources. Obviously, you could link them through protest. You know, they're all examples of citizens protesting for something. Source one is talking about the importance of nonviolence in citizen protests. And if that happens, then anyone can be involved in a protest. You don't need to be an armed soldier conducting a revolution or a coup d'etat. You're just a citizen that is marching in peaceful protest. Source two is showing you peaceful protest in action. It's showing you the power of peaceful protest, in that sure, the police have the weapons and they have the force and might, but they can't really use it because if they do, they lose sympathy and the protesters gain sympathy. And then finally, in your third source, again, it's showing you nonviolence. I mean, how could Tank Man, um, how is he going to symbolize violence? How could he even carry out violence? He has nothing. He's got a briefcase in his left hand, and he's staring into the barrel of a giant T-72 tank. So again, nonviolent protest. So that could be a theme that links the three sources. It's showing you the effectiveness of nonviolent protest. And again, to finish this off, we need one more relationship um, among the three sources to really have done this the right way. What you could do is, to me, this one happened first. I wouldn't say it was the birth of nonviolent protest, but it's one of the most iconic examples of nonviolent protest, and perhaps it helps inspire, the photograph in source two, and even the commentary in source one. Or maybe source one is the theory behind nonviolent protest. Here's how it can work. And the other two are examples of the theory depicted in source number one, demonstrating nonviolent protest and maybe the effectiveness of nonviolent protest. I can't think of much else we could talk about for relationships. I think we've done the job. So there you go. That's the last time you'll ever do this. It's the last time I'll do this year. I hope you got a lot out of it, and I hope you spend the rest of your life dissecting images in social studies, history, and current events. Thanks for listening.